Okay, so hello everyone. Um, I'm Giovanni. It's pronounced Joe, okay? Because usually English people say is Giovanni, but okay. I'm a physicist, but I actually work a lot with web applications, and I code principally in Python, some Ruby, Java, JavaScript, but yeah, I principally work in Python. I work at Self, and I'm CTO since the last year. And I love open source, actually. I work a lot with open source projects. Since I started working with web application, I contributed to several projects. And today I'm presenting weppy, which is a web framework I wrote, and I started working on it since 2014. So, first question, why another web framework in 2017? Because we all know that, yeah, a lot of frameworks actually are released nowadays. But the real question was, why another web framework in 2014? Because I started working on it in 2014. And to people asking me this question, I actually, for joking, reply, why not? But actually, the real motivation about writing a new framework is that I worked for years with different frameworks, with different web frameworks in Python, Django, Flask, Web2Py. I contributed to Web2Py projects. But yeah, after some time working with these frameworks, I started asking myself quite frequently, why should I do this particular thing in this way? You know, sometimes you writing a web application, you find out that some schemes of the framework guides you to some paths that you actually don't understand, or you don't feel is really what you need. And so I started asking myself, but what is the purpose of a web framework? What is a web framework? So I started thinking about a word, which is tool. And if you open up a vocabulary, you find out that the definition of tool is something intended to make a task easier. So the key word here is easier. A tool should let you do something really easier. You shouldn't spend time knowing how to make that peculiar thing with that tool, because the aim of the tool is to build that thing. And the other question that usually people ask me is, are you reinventing the wheel? And I usually reply with this. How many screwdrivers you can find in a single shop? I mean, a screwdriver, you have principally two types, the Phillips one and the flat blade. I mean, it's a screwdriver. But so, in the same way, it's a tool. But why you have so many screwdrivers? I mean, the types are two. And this is only one brand. You have several brands of screwdrivers, and it's the same tool. So why we are inventing the screwdriver every month, every year? Because we are humans. So the shape of your hand maybe acts better with a specific brand of screwdrivers compared to another one. And choosing a framework when you're programming is the same thing. I mean, choosing a framework is choosing a way of thinking, a way of coding. So the definition I use for a web framework is a tool intended to let write your application easier than without it. So I found myself at a certain point forgetting the easier part. I found myself having too much difficulties using popular frameworks. And so I started thinking about the principle I wanted in a framework, in a tool that should make my life easier. And the first principle for me in a web framework is that should be easy to be used. I don't have to spend more time on the framework than on my product, because I'm building something. And the second principle is, okay, magic is cool. I mean, it's amazing. But I also have to have the control on what's happening on my application. And the third principle, web applications are used by clients, hopefully a lot of clients. So performance is a key fact, because I spend money to host my web application. And if the performance is not good, I spend more money to serve the same number of requests. And so I just started building a new framework based on this principle. And yeah, so I just tried to build up a real tool that made my life easier. Because as I said before, a framework is also a way of thinking. And so I just built up something that make my way of thinking and my way of building web application easier. And it's a full stack framework, because I wanted something to use on every project I do, not just one, and then switch the stack on another project. So, briefly, a little bit of story. I started in 2014, and the first alpha stage of weppy was released in October. Then key milestone was the ORM, which was introduced just in the 2015, in August. And in January of 2016, at Self, we actually built the first real deployed application using this framework. And the last milestone is from the last month. So I finally, yeah, I actually do that when I release the 1.0. So it's kind of the first, let's say, stable release of my framework. So what's in the box? It's full stack, so it contains actually quite a lot of things you usually need in web application. So the routing, obviously, an ORM, the authentication system, form generation, translation and multi-languages, templating, etc. There's more, but actually we don't have time to see everything which is inside. And as I said before, one key fact for me was that performance does matter when you build a web application. Because generally, in the web application world, you have a lot of problems regarding performance, dependent and not dependent on the framework. But in general, I saw this thing that you usually, when have to choose a framework, you have two big sides on performance usually, because you have the full stack frameworks that sacrifice performance generally, and the micro ones that actually runs faster, but you have a lack of features. So the perfect example is Django and Flask. Flask is actually faster than Django, but doesn't have anything inside it except for routing and templates, which are actually Jinja. So it's another project. And I just started asking myself, why? I mean, why a full stack framework had to be slower compared to a micro framework? And in fact, weppy actually performs quite good. I mean, this is some benchmarks from Tech and Power. They made 3-4 rounds of benchmark of a lot of web frameworks in several languages. This is a preview from the next round that will be out probably in these days. And these are some popular Python web framework. So this is quite a stupid benchmark actually, because it's just the serialization in JSON of Hello World. But you can see that actually is a full stack framework that performs better than Pyramid or Flask. And when you use a database on a web application, you actually find out that is quite good compared to Django, because it's simple. I mean, the core of web is really, really simple. And it's quite good actually to see that on the database, web is secondary just to Java web frameworks. So, I mean, it's a quite good performance actually. And I didn't write the framework for performance. It's just a simple core. So it was like a surprise to me to see how good is the performance of weppy. And since I said that we actually made in production some application, this is the real response times from some services we made with weppy itself. And the average response times is actually quite good. On the, for example, on the public APIs we have an average time of 11 milliseconds. So it's, yeah, quite good. So I think you are here to see what is weppy. So it's like Flask. The Hello World example is practically exactly like Flask. But if you just want to make JSON, the code is different, because I usually use, sorry for the lang trick, decorators instead of calling JSONify in Flask. And for example, if you want to use query parameter from the query string of the path, you actually just access to the params of the request. And this is a simple hello with the name of the client passed by the query parameter. So the routing is quite similar to Flask, because I loved a lot the routing of Flask. So it's quite the same, even in the parameters. So you can actually write down a parameters in your path, and this will be a parameter of your exposed function. The good thing is that if you write down a route with an integer argument, it will be really casted to an integer, so you don't have to recast the parameters. And this is true also for float or for dates. So if you actually wrote something with weppy which contain a date, you will have with 1.0 you will have a pendulum object, which pendulum is a library, a quite recent library, that acts like the datetime one. So it's basically an extension of a datetime object. And you can obviously use conditional parameters. It's kind of like regex notation. And the good thing is that if the parameter is not present, the one you will have to the function is none. So you can actually make if on parameters. Obviously, you have HTTP methods and the reverse routing, so you can actually have this function in weppy, which is URL, and you pass the name of the explicit function and the arguments. Quite easy. So in web application, we use a lot of sessions. So to use a session, actually in weppy you have some managers. So this example is for the cookies, to store the session data in cookies. You just have to put the manager into the application pipeline, because in weppy, every route has a pipeline, which is, yes, you build some objects that are actually pipes, and the request simply flow through the pipeline. It's like middleware in Django, and then you just import the session from weppy, and you can do whatever you want on the session object. It's like a dictionary, but actually you can store and get attributes with the dot notation, like attributes, and includes some handlers. I really encourage people to use Redis for sessions because it's quite fast. And then you will render. So I included a templating engine. And one key fact about templating engines in Python is that I never get why we invented a new language in templating. I mean, why not to use just Python? So the templating engine of weppy just use simple Python code with some helpers added. For example, you can see the extend statement at the first line. But yeah, actually, it's just Python. So you just have to put the pass for the indentation because the code is not indented. But you don't have to write, I don't know, and for, and if, and strange things. And you can actually use the built-in function of the Python library. So for example, I can make also, I don't know, an enumerate on the posts array, for example. And yeah, I can use any built-in method of Python. And you actually want to translate messages to your user. So the translation is actually quite easy because you just import the T method from weppy and put your messages inside as a parameter of this function. And then you just write the translation files in your applications. Obviously, it supports formatting, so you can pass actually formatted arguments and whatever. And weppy will use the asset language header from the request to find out which language is good. Or you can use routing. So you can configure your application to use the routing, the router to build languages, so you can differentiate the paths of your routes. Then you usually need a database in your application. So I wrote an ORM, also because I totally dislike the Django ORM. And the key concept is that working with databases shouldn't be a pain. Okay, so how to use a database in weppy? Well, you just import the model class, the database class, and the field class, and you actually define your models with the columns you need, and you just pass this model to the define models method of the database, and you add the database pipeline to the database pipe to the pipeline of your application in order to guarantee the connection. So what's good about weppy models is that relationship relationships are quite easy to write. So in this example, we have a user and the post models, and the relationship is one to many. So every user has many posts, and the validation is actually wrote down with just a dictionary of instructions. So in this case, we are, for example, validating the fact that the user mail should be a mail. So weppy includes a validator to check if an email is valid. And in the post, we validates the presence of the body. So it gives you 4 different helpers for relations. So you have the belongs to helper, the refers to helper, the as one and the as many. And the key difference between the belongs to and the refers to is that the belongs to is a strong relation. So you cannot have an existing record that doesn't have the relation, while the refers to is conditional. So the one-to-many we have already seen is just like belongs to has many. The one-to-one is quite similar, with an except you use the has one helper and you validate the uniqueness of the referred relation. And the many-to-many relationship is actually used with 2 as many and 1 belongs to on the join table. So a key difference between the majority of the ORMs on the market is that you usually just write the 2 side. You usually don't write the between model, the join table. But I wanted to make developers confident on what's happening on the database. So since it's quite easy to write a many-to-many relationship in weppy, I just wanted the developer to write it, actually. I mean, I want the developer to be confident of the fact that you have a join table between a many-to-many relationship. And yeah, validation we see before supports quite a lot of features, like the presence, the check on the length of the field, the check on some numbers. So you, for example, let's say you have an age field and you want to be greater or equal to 18. And once you define your models, creating record is quite easy. So let's define a dog model and then create a dog. And what you see actually is that the system doesn't return you a dog instance, because another key important difference in the weppy compared to the other ones is that the model class is just a class. It doesn't create instances of objects, because instead made you work with raw object, because you're actually working with raw from the databases. So I didn't want a layer between the results from the database and the model itself. I can add some validation to the dog, and if I try to create a dog without a name, the system just say me, okay, errors, name is empty. But actually I can avoid the validation talking directly to the DB, because the database instance, actually, there's a difference between the model and the database instance, because dog is the model, but db.dog is the table. So you actually can also, if you want, bypass the model layer and talk directly with the database. What's a good thing about, another good thing about the ORM of weppy? Making queries, which is the thing you do more often in your application, and you have usually some problems because you understand or not the SQL language. So even that, the principle was to don't use raw strings, don't use strange attributes. It's just like using Python objects to make queries. So let's define a new model, an event. So I have a name, a location, a number of participants, and a date. And I can make some queries like that. So the where event location is in New York, or is the same compact. The second line is a more compact version. So if you just call the DB, it's like calling DB where. And you have quite a lot of operators. So you can actually write something like this. So you can, I don't know, take the events in Hill Valley that have less than 200 participants, or events happening on a specific date, or some event in the futures which are not in New York or Chicago. And the query language is simple because you actually e.location in the last example, E is your event model, and location is a field object which represents a column in your database. So you can actually select some records, and as we saw before, are row objects. Okay, so you have actually the column as keys and values of your fields. And this is another example to take just the first result. You have some shortcuts, obviously. If you just want to query directly for the first event in which have the name secret party, you can just write event get. And obviously you have ordering of records. So even in this case, you use the fields of your model. And the pagination, of course. And the good thing is that you can do aggregation quite easier, because in this example we are grouping the event by location, and we are counting how many events you have in those locations with just 4 lines. And obviously you have updating and deleting, etc., etc. You have scopes, which are actually some methods you write in directly on your model, because if you run a query quite often, it's handy to have a method to just simplify your filtering. So if I define two scopes, one is named hot and one is named between on my event model, I can actually write down queries more easily. And obviously, since you have row objects and not instances of your models, you have some decorators to create virtual fields above your rows. So you have attributes and methods. You have obviously callbacks, which are decorators. And you can define indexes directly into your model. So you can write combined indexes. Actually, the system supports even conditional indexes. You can write where conditions, etc. And it gives you also the migration engine. And you don't have to write migrations, because actually the system generates them from your models. Yeah, I'm sorry, the resolution is quite small, but actually, yeah, it will generate migrations for you with all the instruction that should be performed. And then you have all the commands to migrate up and down, etc., etc. A good thing about models in weppy is that you can actually, since you manually pass the model to the database with the define models function, you actually can create how many models you want and use subclassing and inheritance to build up one single model from several classes. So let's say I wanted to create a timestamped model. So I have the created at and the updated at fields that automatically will be will contains the now time when I create or update a record. And I also want records that are soft deletable. So when actually the client tries to delete a record, I actually just set a date and keep it. So I defined some default values, some update values, some scopes, some fields, and I just can write a post model that is a subclass of these other two models, and actually the system will just merge everything into this single model. You actually want to build forms from your models, and is quite easily because you can just use the form method of your model, and or you can write forms using the same objects of the ORM. There's an auth module in weppy, which actually gives you everything you need to manage the users in your application. So yeah, it's just a module that you initialize, passing your application in the database, and it will expose some routes for the login, for the logout, the registration, email verification, the retrieval of the password, etc. And you have everything you need to actually manage groups, permissions, to block users. And you also have access control, because the auth module gives you some helpers like the isLogged method. So you can actually import the requires decorator from weppy and decorate a route in order to protect it. And you also can mix decorators between them, so you can actually also require some, I don't know, JSON routes to be protected. And then you have debugging. Debugging is a key factor of a web framework because you have to easily understand and quickly understand what's wrong with your application, because there are too many times where things go wrong. And I know that, and weppy knows that too. So there's an included debugger with everything you need, with the application stack, with the framework stack, with the single frames of what happened into your application, variables, etc., etc. And yes, you can also make controllers. They are not actually controllers, but if you like the MVC pattern, you actually can create a structure in your application that emulates controllers. So you just import this controller you write into your application, and you can use the module method of your application object that actually create a container of several routes. So you can use path prefix or host names, dedicated pipelines. It's like writing a controllers. And weppy is full stack, but loves extensions too. So right now we have some extensions. You can have the assets pipeline. So if you work with a lot of assets, JavaScript, CSS, CoffeeScripts, whatever, this extension make your life easier. The weppy REST is an extension to easily write REST controllers on your application, and the Sentry one is for keeping errors on the Sentry platform, which is awesome, by the way. And for example, the weppy REST extension actually creates REST endpoints above your models. So once you wrote your models, you can just create a REST module above that model, and yeah, weppy will take care of the rest. It will create the routes for the get, for the post, for the put, etc. And yeah, it's based on decorators too. So if you have to, once you have created your endpoint, you can just inject some helpers. For example, if you want to change how the database set used above your models to serialize things to your users, you can just write a method for that. And yeah, that's it. This is pretty much what weppy does. So plans for the future. Well, some enhancement over the ORM are planned for the next releases. I would also like to rewrite the router for performance, because actually the router is quite easy. I mean, I think that the router in weppy is actually 5 lines. It's just a 4 cycle with the regex notation, and you just try. Okay, so it's not really performant. I would also like to improve the caching system, which we haven't seen, but actually weppy has some helpers in order to make some caching above your routes or etc. And why not? I will think about isomorphism. It's quite a trend right now, so I will think about it. And yeah, that's actually it. I want to reserve some space for questions, curiosities, objections, criticism, whatever you want.
Is there any question?
Hi, Giovanni. Thanks for writing. It's very interesting. I like the idea of typecasting in the URL, because in Django everything is a string and you always have to do type checking before consuming the variable. So that's nice. My question is, can you write your own custom validators? Is it too hard? How will one go about it? A custom function or something?
Okay, writing validators actually is quite easy, because just let me get back to yes. Wow, a lot of slides. And yeah, so in the different operations you have as validations, you have also a custom key. So you just write name custom, and then you pass a callable, so a function or a class that should accept the value coming from the request, and you can do whatever you want with the value. So yeah, writing a custom validator is just writing a function.
It's quite beautiful, because I have experience with Django and it's quite painful sometimes. I ask for the new era of JavaScript framework like Angular or Vue. Is possible to integrate it with the template of weppy or not? Because now the fluid form is more acceptable or more likely for the end of the user.
Okay, right now there's no integration with the, for example, the validation system, because yeah, right now, for example, at Self we use an Ember application which uses weppy as a backend, but we actually just communicate in JSON APIs. So, but is on the plans for the future to, I mean, since the validation is actually just a dictionary, will be probably easy to integrate this validation in JavaScript because it's easy to port, except for custom validations actually, but okay. So it's in the plan to investigate which one is the best way to integrate with front-end frameworks. Probably the first step will be to try making some components with React directly from weppy. So the first step I would probably try will be to actually give to your front-end side some components you can use with React, for example. And then if this experiment, let's say, will work, then the path is more easier to integrate with Angular and other things. But yeah, right now it's no. You cannot integrate forms you build with Angular directly with weppy. You have to communicate with JSON.
Did you check the ORM's performance against other Python's performance with other Python ORM's performance? And have you thought about releasing weppy's ORM as an independent package?
Okay. I didn't publish the results right now, except for the benchmark I showed you at the very initial part, which is this is a selection from the database. So, well, the fact that weppy performs better than situation where you have SQL Alchemy, where you have the Django ORM. I don't know what parameter used, but is a symptom of the performance of the ORM is quite good. Right now, it's quite like Pee-wee. I don't know if you know Pee-wee. Yeah, it's comparable. Only if you actually don't use the optimizations of Pee-wee because they're written in Python. But yes, it's comparable with Pee-wee. And yes, for the separate package, probably the next major release, so the 2.0, will be splitted in components. Are several months that I'm thinking of separate the templating system, the ORM system, and some things about weppy into different packages to improve the user base. So will definitely happen one day.
Question? Is it possible to use raw SQL in ORM or weppy?
Yes, because your database class has an execute SQL method, and you just pass the SQL string. So it's like that. Obviously, you lose everything regarding the ORM stack. So you will have a rows object, like if you're using the ORM, but you don't have all the, I don't know, virtual attributes or... but yes, you can do it.
Any more questions?
Hello. My question is, I saw a lot of nice ideas in your work, but why did you choose to build another web framework, as in your question in the beginning of the slides, and not improve upon the other stuff that's out there. I mean, for a user point of view, why would you suggest to use your monolithic framework against a composition of other tools that makes most of the stuff you made weppy do?
Okay, this is a nice question. Well, on the first part you said, I tried. I mean, I contributed to the Web2Py project, which is the one that I used the most to write weppy, because some of the components are highly inspired from Web2Py. So on the first step, I tried to change Web2Py the way it worked, but I mean, changing one of the of these big frameworks today. So it's like if you want to change totally the Django models. I mean, you can try, but it's almost impossible to have the community to say, oh yeah, okay, let's change everything. No, it's quite difficult actually to change. So that was the main problem about making an existing framework something I really wanted to be, because yeah, maybe I could make some small edits, but I'm quite sure I would never have been able to do all this into an existing project, you know. And on the second part, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, because why I would suggest to use weppy. It's like asking why we would suggest to use Aurelia on the framework side, on the front-end web framework side. Why I should use, I don't know, PW or MM instead of SQL Alchemy? Why I should use whatever. I mean, if you actually like it and you have the time to try it, I think it's a good thing to just to get out of the mental form the other frameworks give to you, because there are some key differences which I mean, I think it's a good thing to change perspectives sometimes, change a bit your point of view. And obviously, I'm not the Django Foundation, so I don't have the same power, the same stability, the same, I don't know, coding performance in terms of how many developers are on weppy. So obviously, yeah, it's just like, I mean, it's quite like using Flask actually, because in Flask you actually pick a lot of extensions, and then if you have a problem with an extension, or the developer of the extension just say, okay, I'm done, you run the same problem. So yeah, we use in production in our company, and it's more than a year that we don't have any real problems. So production side, I say you have to trust me, but you know, it's yeah. I don't know. The most important reason to try weppy is, I think, is to try some new point of view about how we do old school web development on Python, because yeah, you know, now there's the async and whatever, but I think we can innovate also the old stack. I mean, the synchronous stack, the Django, Flask, Pyramid scene, you know.
We have time for one small question. Just a question about the future of weppy. What I mean, do you plan to keep simplicity of weppy, or do you plan to growing in functionality in the near future?
Okay. Right now, I mean, the community of weppy is quite small. I mean, I try to help a lot of the people trying to build projects with weppy, and but yeah, since the 1.0, there's no big features plan. I mean, are more like small features, small enhancement on the ORM, and all the rest will be what the community wants. I mean, because right now I think the feature stack is quite good in weppy. So next features will be probably what people that use weppy wants to.
Thank you.